delightful day. I'm very grateful for the Department of History's invitation, the Department of Philosophy, the Muslim community here, anyone else who had a hand in bringing me here. It's a delight to be here, and it's especially a delight to be here with this current topic before us, because this subject brings me back to the very reason I went to graduate school. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Notre Dame, my particular program for the study of the great books required us to write a senior thesis. It wasn't really that involved, but it was a substantive research paper. And my substantive senior essay was devoted to the whole question of prophecy, philosophy, and the political life within Al-Ghazali's masterwork of political philosophy, the last book he wrote. And so it was really this idea that the love of learning and the love of truth, going back all the way into the Hellenistic Greek tradition, that this love then found its way in the medieval world within the revelation communities, the revelation-based communities. And how Al-Farabi then adapted and worked with the Greek tradition in harmony with the Islamic understandings of revelation and prophecy, how he was able to reconcile and work those elements together in his love of philosophy, his love of wisdom, and his search for God, that really just ignited a fire in my mind, and it made me want to learn more. And it definitely sealed the deal for my resolve to go to graduate school. And so it's a great delight to come back to Al-Farabi, and I'm thinking very seriously about moving back into that primary or that original interest, because while there are still, as we'll learn today, while there are still people alive who were architects and collaborators in the 1979 revolution of Islam, a book needs to be written about that 1979 revolution as an attempt to bring Al-Farabi's utopian political ideals into reality. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute. But those oral histories need to be taken, and someone needs to sit down with some of these aged ayatollahs, some of whose names strike fear into the hearts of our intelligence communities and our militaries. But someone needs to sit down with them and talk about the utopian motivations that were underlying the 1979 revolution. And I'll give some reasons for that as we go forward. That's not our topic today, but it's important to know that even reaching back more than 1,000 years, sometimes ideas have power. And we must never deny or never ignore the past, because sometimes the past is one of the, or perhaps more than we'd like to admit, the past is often in the driver's seat of the current moment. So we return to Al-Farabi, someone who is deemed by the historians of philosophy as really the most formative or influential of all the Muslim philosophers. When we say Muslim philosophers, we don't mean that these were people who only did philosophy. These were people of learning. These were scientists, they were botanists, they were students of anatomy, they were students of philosophy, they were students of many things. And their view of knowledge, very different from the contemporary view, their view of knowledge was holistic. And so one of the things about Al-Farabi that we find that for him, political philosophy and prophecy and anatomy and mathematics and music, that they all seem to speak together in a kind of organic conversation that to him was a natural unfolding of the pursuit of knowledge. So we can talk a little bit about his biography. There's not much to know. We know that from his name, Farab, someone from the Turkish town of Farab. And the last name is a nisba adjective meaning someone from Farab. But so he was Turkish in origin. That'll be good news to some of the people in the room. But he found his way to Baghdad, which at that point was the emerging cultural capital of the entire Near Eastern world, because he wanted to study philosophy. and there was nowhere within the traditional Islamic world at that point where he could go to really learn the Greek tradition, the Hellenistic tradition. So we know that at some point he found his way to Baghdad. And there he found Christian monks, some Nestorian and some Jacobite. But he found Christian monks who had basically set up what historians of philosophy will call the Alexandrian school of philosophy in Baghdad. And so this was a continuation of the classical Aristotelian and Platonic philosophical traditions, but very much through the lens of Plotinus and Porphyry and what we call the Neoplatonic tradition. So the school of Alexandria was found in Baghdad, and Al-Farabi found his way and asked to be the student, the first Muslim student of these Nestorian monks. We know one of his teachers, by name at least, Abu Bishr Matta bin Yunus, was a famous scholar of logic. And at one point, Abu Bishr Matta bin Yunus got involved in a debate that was recorded by its observers. And by all accounts, he lost to his Muslim opponent. And in many ways, this public debate, became a proxy war between Islam versus Christianity, and it became a kind of proxy war between the primacy of revelation or the primacy of reason. And in some ways, it was a war between the guy who spoke Arabic natively and the guy who was Syriac speaking and who spoke Arabic in a halting way. But in many ways, his teacher's humiliation at the hands of a Muslim grammarian gave rise to a strong interest in Al-Farabi for the philosophy of language. And so again, that's not our topic today, but we'll refer to it as we go forward. So there isn't much that we know. We know that toward the end of his life, as Baghdad was really becoming a politically fragmented place, and the illusion or the dream of a kind of unified caliphate was really falling apart. We know that he left Baghdad and went to the court of a warlord prince in Aleppo, Saif ad-Dawla. And he went and he lived his remaining years before he died in 950 of the Common Era. He lived his remaining years in the court of Saif ad-Dawla and devoted himself to his music, to his mathematics, and to the writing of his most definitive political treatise, the book of the principles of the opinions of the people of the virtuous city. And this Kitab Mabadi Ara Ahl al-Madinat al-Fadila. This book, this long-winded, this difficultly titled book, became, in many ways, the most thorough articulation of some of the ideas that we're going to talk about today, but also crystallized this utopian vision of a society not governed by philosopher kings, but a society that was brought into being by a prophet philosopher king. And thereafter was ruled and governed and held together by a community of jurisconsults, that is, a community of religious scholars of Islamic law. And how in many ways then this then becomes the seed which 1,000 years later will reappear as a young tree in the 1979 revolution, when we have Ayatollah Khomeini himself quoting Al-Farabi directly about this ambition to establish on earth the virtuous city, al-Madinat al-Fadila. In any case, Al-Farabi, by all accounts, didn't get married. Al-Farabi, by all accounts, never got involved in politics, which were very messy and dramatic and brutal in his day. But he wrote about politics. Al-Farabi kept to himself. He never really had a social impact in his time. In fact, in his moment, he was known more as a performer of music and as a musical theorist than he was known as a philosopher of language, or a philosopher of political thought, political philosophy, or of anything else. We know that he was kind of reclusive and was a person of tremendous personal austerity. So we don't have children he left behind. We don't have a school that he founded. We don't have a governorship that he was given by any warlord or prince. But we have some of these incredible books that were left behind. And so that's about all we can say about his history. We know that he was born around 870 of the Common Era, and he died around 950. He died in Aleppo, lived most of his adult life in Baghdad, and he becomes perhaps the most important of all of the scholars that we celebrate today as the Muslim philosophers. So there's a way in which we can talk about Al-Farabi biographically. There's also a way we can talk about him as someone important in the history of philosophy. Very often, at least until now, historians of philosophy have kind of skipped from the late antique period, the late antiquity period where we have Plotinus and Porphyry, to sort of medieval Europe in the Renaissance and then the rise of modern Western thought. And so for many years, the medieval Muslim philosophers, as instrumental as they were in the shaping of minds like Maimonides and like Thomas Aquinas, the medieval Muslim chapter of the history of philosophy was just skipped over and ignored. But that said, as we then go back and explore that chapter, Al-Farabi, probably of all the Muslim philosophers, he was not the most famous of the Muslim philosophers, but I would argue that he is by far the most important. Because after he came, all philosophers stood upon the foundations of his thought. And even though we have some people who are known to us as philosophers before Al-Farabi, and others, most notably Avicenna, who came after Al-Farabi, Al-Farabi's presence in the history of the Islamic philosophy chapter was absolutely formative and seminal. There's no one whose influence perhaps was greater than his. So we can talk about his influence then upon Ibn Sina and therefore indirectly upon Maimonides or upon Thomas Aquinas. We can talk about his influence upon the Andalusian philosopher Ibn Tufayl, who's received some press recently for his famous philosophical novel called Living Son of the Awake, Hayy ibn Yaqzan. We'll talk about that later too. We can talk about his very prominent role in shaping Maimonides' understanding of prophecy and philosophy. Very important. In fact, I would argue that the key to understanding the most difficult part of the guide, which is the Ezekiel vision, the Ezekiel chapter, the key to that is all in Farabian metaphysics. If you read the Guide of Maimonides through the lens of Al-Farabi's metaphysics, everything lines up and everything begins to make sense. We can talk about his influence in the development of Arab and Islamic notions of mathematics and music, but the fact is that Al-Farabi was so brilliant, he himself invented a whole musical language, but he was so brilliant that very few after him could really even follow what he was saying. And so one of his great works is what he called the Big Book of Music, Kitab al-Musiq al-Kabir, the Big Book of Music. And I've only, in my entire 53 years, I've only met one person who was smart enough to read it and understand it. But it remains one of his greatest works because he understood music through Greek mathematics. And he understood music to be a branch of mathematics, which is how the ancients understood music. It was a mathematical science. And so Al-Farabi devoted a tremendous amount of effort, not just to the study of music and mathematics, but of actually using that expertise in mathematics to craft a language for music that never took on because it was just too complicated and too complex. We can talk about many other aspects of his thought, but today we want to talk about his attempt to reconcile the continuing debate about religion and science, which for him translated to philosophy and prophecy. Now it helped that he was shaped by the Neoplatonic tradition of philosophy, which understood that there was one uncaused cause, that there was one supreme reality, and that all reality emanated eternally and is emanating eternally from that one. And that philosophy then becomes the attempt to know the true realities of things as they truly are, without the mediation of language and symbol or any other crutch or human cultural device. And so the kind of philosophy that he understood to be Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy, the kind of philosophy that he embraced was a philosophy that demanded both rigorous study and the rigorous mortification of the soul. Because it was understood to be a practice, that is the practice of philosophy, a practice that led to the separability of the intellect, the rational soul, from the material soul. And so it was about human assent. And his understanding of philosophy, which he inherited from the Neoplatonists, his understanding was that philosophy then culminated in a kind of experience of unification, this mystical almost unification of the human mind with the divine minds that have emanated from the supreme mind. And so philosophy then ends in this state of what we might call illumination. And he says at this point, he says the active intellect, which is one of the emanations, one of these pure intellectual emanations from the One, these angelic beings, if you will, that at this point then the divine light illumines the mind and does to the mind what light does to our vision. And at that point, he says, the intellect in potential becomes completely activated. And that person, he says, knows pure bliss. And upon death, that rational soul is absolutely separable and then lives eternity in a state of bliss. The problem, of course, with this Neoplatonic idea of philosophy is that there are very few human beings who would ever be, one, intellectually capable of achieving it, and two, there are very few people who would be motivated by some kind of promise of illumination and separability, right? This kind of theoretical idea of knowing truth as it truly is, unmediated by any language or symbol. There are very few people who would be motivated by that to actually do the rigorous work of self-purification and intellectual training that would eventually lead to a state of conjunction with the active intellect. And so I failed to do something that I should have asked all of you to do, and that is to turn my phone off. I thought I did. And so for Al-Farabi then, the problem of the one and the many, that is the problem of this world of multiplicity and how it relates to that believed world or that believed unity of origin. And then the existential problem and the communal problem of how do we get back to that one. That this problem then is unsolvable except in rare individual cases of people who have both the acumen and the inspiration and the direction to pursue a life of philosophy. Because here in philosophy, we're not talking about an academic department. And we're not talking about some kind of, no offense, goatee-growing, hand-rolled cigarette smoking, intellectual discourse. For him, philosophy was a way of life. It was a way of being. It was a supreme and grave commitment that would necessitate a complete alteration of the way you lived in the world. And for him, it truly is, by all accounts, the way he himself lived. But the problem is what do we do with the rest of humanity? If those few individuals are able to achieve bliss or able to achieve happiness, able to achieve that state of eternality, of separability from this material form, if just a few people throughout history have the ability and the motivation to make it, then what about the rest of us? And so this is where Al-Farabi's situatedness within a revelation-based community makes the discussion interesting. It's because then he observed, right, that there were these communities which understood that their relationship with truth was not a relationship with philosophy, but it was rather a relationship that included linguistic and symbolic descriptions of what that truth is, that include sometimes even very disappointingly simple, let's say, descriptions of the state of well-being after death if someone abides by this religion. This idea of eternal happiness and gardens beneath which rivers flow. Al-Farabi noticed that there were communities that promised that same kind of bliss, but in metaphorical terms, and not through the practice of philosophy, but through a different kind of practice. And so Al-Farabi then began to think about metaphysics and its relationship to psychology, and he began to see, or at least in his own understanding of, sorry about the video there, but in his own understanding of the human mind then, he came to understand that intellect, while the intellect and the rational soul remains the most godly, the most divine element within the human being, okay? And in this, he's very much following a tradition all the way back to Aristotle. He also believed that below the intellect, the most sublime faculty within the mind was the imagination. Now, by imagination, he doesn't mean sort of just making things up and imagining, like having imaginary friends. It wasn't that kind of use. By imagination, he meant that part of the soul which works with images. And that part of the soul which also is a storehouse for images, meaning everything that you've ever seen, everything that you've ever heard, every food that you've ever tasted, every smell that you've ever smelled, these all get stored as images within the imaginative faculty. Okay? In Arabic, he called this both khayal and takhayyul, but it's this imaginative faculty. And this imaginative faculty then is second only to the intellect in terms of the hierarchy of the faculties of the soul. Now, why is this important? It's important because he believed that not only was philosophy then the journey from the many, to the one, right, through the intellect, where you would come to know truth as it truly is, right? Not as you expect it to be or not as you want it to be, but something even beyond language. And this has to do with his own belief that thought is prior to language and that thought is not contingent upon language. It goes back to his teacher's debate and tragic debate in which he lost. But Al-Farabi is upholding the same idea as his teacher. That is that thought precedes language. And that thought is not dependent or contingent upon language. And so then this is the ascent of the world of the many to the world of the one through the perfection of the rational soul or the intellectual faculty. He said that this path is made by few, as we've said, this path of ascent. He said, but the one, the supreme one, is also an entity, a mind, which is constantly emanating and also reaching out to the created world in a non-personified way. And so he believed that imagination then becomes, or prophecy, okay, if this is philosophy, then prophecy is that same divine light coming down, condescending into the world of the many, not as it truly is, but reflected and refracted in language and symbols that everyone can understand. And so he believed that even though this is possible for the many, for the multiplicity of human beings who don't have access to this, that they still have the opportunity to achieve a level of moral purification and thus rational soul separability from the body, meaning they still have a salvific hope through the condescension, or the condescension, of the one to the world of the many, but not as it truly is, but through language and through symbols. And so in the mind of the prophet, if we take this board then to be a kind of map of the mind of what he calls the prophet philosopher. Prophet philosopher then is someone who knows the truth as it truly is, but whose imagination becomes almost like a crystal prism in which the pure divine light shines and then gets reflected and refracted in numerous ways for the benefit of the people who have no access to philosophy. Now, we all know, we have lots of professors, we've all had professors who really know their stuff, but are absolutely incapable of communicating their stuff, their knowledge, to regular people, right? We've all met people like this. We know that they know their stuff. And when they wrote the book that we're studying, they become sort of the academic's academic, right? These people who are so rarefied in their academic study that they've lost their ability to speak to regular people. And so there are, of course, it's possible that someone could be a philosopher and yet never have the ability to communicate these mind-blowing realities that they've discovered to everyday people. And so Al-Farabi says it is that rare occurrence of a human being who has the ability to know truth as it truly is, but then whose imagination has also been sanctified to the extent that that person then is not only able to describe it in ways that you and I can understand, but can also describe the ways in which we must begin to live in order to engage it, in order to step toward it, in order to move toward that truth or that reality. And that's why Al-Farabi said that the theoretical part of the imaginative faculty will then take theoretical concepts like God, or like paradise, or like angels, these theoretical concepts, and will give them names and give them images, right? And then the practical aspect of the prophet's imagination then will give rise to practices and laws and ways of being and ways of living that will train the soul in the same way that the philosophers train the soul, but here you're doing it not because you rationally see the benefit in it, but because this is something that's been commanded by God through the mediation of the prophet and prophecy. So what we have here then for Al-Farabi is we have this attempt to say, look, truth is one. Truth is the same truth. The truth of philosophy and the truth of prophecy, it's the same truth. The truth of science and the truth of religion, it's the same truth. But these are two very different ways of engaging that truth and two very different kinds of discourses. One seeks to know it as it truly is, even outside of language, and seeks to commune with it in that pure, unadulterated way. And one seeks to motivate people to move in the direction of truth through these imaginative descriptions. And by imaginative, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but the idea is that through these image-based ways of explaining what it is that you're journeying toward, what it is you must do, and what it's going to be like when you get there. And so it's over here that, interestingly, Al-Farabi was a Muslim who was studying under Christians, and then when he talks about religion, he never talks about which one. So he just talks about religion, and he just talks about prophecy. He never mentions the Prophet Muhammad, so we never see the Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, like may God's peace and blessings be upon him. We never see that kind of discourse in Al-Farabi, because Al-Farabi knows that he's not writing theology. What he's trying to do is he's trying to understand from a position of metaphysics and from a position of his understanding of human psychology, how does the process of prophecy work? And what is its relationship to philosophy? Okay. And so what we have then is we have this idea then that the goal of life, of course, is happiness. So Al-Farabi is right with Aristotle in that way. We were born for bliss. We were born to be happy. And happiness, true happiness, according to his own theological understanding, can only be found in the presence of the one, right? So as St. Augustine said, my heart will never rest until it rests in you, and as the Quran says that the hearts of the believers will never rest until they rest in the remembrance of God. But the whole idea is that the teleological journey, the human adventure, let's say, is all about the journey to truth and the journey to God. And that's where happiness is found. And this is why Aristotle says that the good is something you seek for its own sake. It's the one thing that we seek for its own sake. We're all here struggling for degrees, because the degrees are going to lead to the next degree, or the degree is going to lead to a job, and the job is going to lead to a marriage, and that's going to lead to the nice car in the driveway, and the mortgage, and we're always seeking things for the sake of something else. But Aristotle says happiness is what we seek for its own sake. We're not seeking happiness so that we can seek happiness. We're seeking happiness because happiness itself is the goal of our existence. But Aristotle then, in the Nicomachean Ethics, has this long and very intelligent, but hard to read description of all the ways in which we mistake what happiness is. And so then we end up unhappy because we don't really know what happiness is that we're seeking. Farabi is very clear about where happiness is, where bliss is, where eternal life is, where all this is. He's very clear about that, both from the vantage point of philosophy and the vantage point of religion. But one of the interesting things here is that he says that the prophet's intellect, or the prophet's imagination, is so powerful that the language and the symbols that come out of the prophet, it's not like he's choosing, like, okay, so what should God be? It's like, should God be like rain? No. Light? Okay, yeah, light. Sounds good. You know, it's both a wave and a particle and kind of mysterious. And yeah, so, yeah, light. So God is the light of the heavens and the earth. You know, he says it doesn't work that way. It's not that the prophet is there sort of picking and choosing. It's that there's this automatic thing that happens in the mind, the sanctified imagination of the prophet, which then gives rise to the sacred text, the revealed book, which gives rise to these illumined ways of being. So it's not something that the prophet is actually doing. The prophet is just serving as this sanctified receptacle of images. And then when the divine light floods the prophet's mind, and it happens very rarely in history, that the prophet's mind becomes flooded with these images, or this divine light, and then the images just naturally, automatically, providentially get hooked up with images that are that have an affinity for what that reality is. And so then we end up with this body of religious teaching and discourse, which is not just for one person, it's for the plurality, the majority of humankind. And it's a body of religious discourse that is itself compelling and persuasive. Farabi says that this is one of the things about the prophet's imagination, is that the prophetic imagination in its sanctified state will produce these images in the absolute most perfect way that they could be represented, in a way that arouses a desire in the hearts of regular people like you and me to actually start living differently, to actually then follow dietary codes, or to get up at 4 in the morning and say prayers, or to do whatever it is that this religious life flowing. So for Al-Farabi then, religion and prophecy are inherently political. And by political, organizing people to work together to achieve that goal. So in the Aristotelian sense of politics, not maybe in the contemporary Western sense of politics, especially, well, doesn't matter which side of the border we're on, but not in that sense, right? Not in a kind of tainted, worldly, corrupt, kleptocratic sense, but in that sense of politics in its purest form, this idea of human beings collaborating and cooperating and moving together toward a shared goal with a shared purpose. That he says prophecy then is inherently political. And when in history one of these beings emerges, you will always find the emergence of a community. The emergence of a community that will lead to some kind of a political life, like a state or an empire. Because prophecy is about, again, is not about one person making it to the goal, but prophecy is about the mobilization of the masses, of us, to be awakened to that supreme goal, although, albeit that supreme goal now articulated in forms that may, that appeal to us, right? So, for example, and Al-Farabi doesn't say this because he never deals with a particular culture or a particular religion. But you take a pre-Islamic era. I don't know how many of you have been to Saudi Arabia. A couple of us have, maybe. Okay. It's not, I guess it's like the desert of Arizona. Some people would always go to live there by choice, right? Because they love the desert, and the desert has its own beauty. But this is a place where most humans just die because it's too inhospitable, it's too hot, it's too barren, it's too infinitely rugged, right? For the average person to live there. And this is why historians will tell us that the Byzantines, even though the Byzantine army and the Sasanian army of ancient Persia were fighting each other, nobody could hold Arabia because nobody wanted to go there and stay there. You couldn't station an army in Arabia because your army would die and they would desert. No one wants to be there. So the Arabs had free reign, right? The nomadic Arabs had free reign pretty much. Some of them allied themselves with the Byzantines because it was profitable. Some of them allied themselves with the Persians on the edges of the desert. But in the desert itself, nobody could dominate the desert. And the people themselves kind of adopted this indomitable kind of character about them. So that's the way it is. So you take a guy who lives in that world. So what is the supreme, how are we going to describe the supreme goal? Right? It's green, it's lush, water everywhere, right? Fruit everywhere, right? You can have sex there, right? It's Oregon, basically. It's where I grew up, right? It's British Columbia, right? It's like water's it's green, right? It's this place where it's easy, it's cool, it's refreshing, it's abundance of food, abundance of companions. So you tell that this is where we're going. Like, are you with us or not? And the average pre-Islamic Arab would say, okay, so now what do I do? I can remember years ago at the University of Oregon, I had a student who was clearly taking my introduction to Islam with a kind of Cat Stevens kind of spirit, and he was kind of thinking about it for himself. And he was like, so Muslims don't drink, huh? And I said, yeah, the Quran says that there are benefits in alcohol, but the harmful effects outweigh the benefits. So at least observant Muslims, well, there are lots of Muslims who drink, but observant Muslims don't drink. He says, yeah. So it's like, oh. Marijuana? Yeah, so he was just kind of trying to figure it out, right? So, but you tell somebody, right, okay, for these 60 years or whatever, 70 years, or maybe some of us 50, you just have to hold tight, right? But believe me, when you get here, there's no holding down, right? You're just party every day. And so, the average person is going to say, oh, well, okay, cost-benefit analysis. All right, okay. And then so the idea, though, is that the prophetic imagination then is able to articulate this state of well-being, of unity with the good in a way that is desirable, persuasive, and arguably a fair picture of what being in a state of well-being might look like according to our vantage point. So this is what we got to do. Okay, you got to start praying. You got to start fasting. You have these dietary rules you start doing. You have to start giving money to the poor. If you've got surplus, you've got to start. So this life of rigor then accidentally becomes part of our life because we've been promised what it leads to. Whereas the philosopher is embracing those things because the philosopher understands that these things are in themselves essential steps toward detaching oneself from the created realm so that one can journey into a realm which is beyond the created, beyond the physical realm. Okay? So now all of this then speaks of an understanding now of religion which is not, as some critics might say, even in his own time, which is not critical of religion, would say. So he's not saying that, okay, religion, the religious scholars are below the philosophers in our society, or that religion is somehow less than philosophy. That wasn't his intention at all. What his intention was to try to find a way that philosophy and prophecy could be reconciled, and philosophy and prophecy could be understood through the natural framework of human psychology, how is it even possible? He lived in a world where prophecy was taken for granted. Right? We've got Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, all these prophets running around in the prophetic history. He lived in a world where even with Zoroastrians, with Zoroaster, Zardosht, there's an assumption that prophecy was a real thing. And so his work then, as a religious philosopher, was to try to find a way to reconcile. Now this has profound implications. Profound implications for then what we understand today to be the problem of religious pluralism, the problem of religious diversity. And this is what I want to focus on today. And I want to kind of open up a conversation about the challenge of religious diversity. Al-Farabi is a smart guy. And it's clear that he is intentionally including and withholding according to his own mastery of his own discourse. So Al-Farabi is not going to chase down the implications. But let's just think for a moment. What are the implications? If this is how we understand religion, then our understanding of religion is going to be, in some ways, contingent upon our relationship with language and our relationship with symbols. Okay? And so, the idea, we live in a world where there are many sacred books, there are many revealed books, there are many sacred scriptures. They happen to be in various languages, having emerged at various times in history. And one of the things that Al-Farabi is very clear about is that the prophet, then the prophetic imagination is going to be a storehouse of images which is perfectly suited for that one particular moment and cultural reality in which the prophetic imagination is situated. Right? So Jesus, for example, is talking a lot about, in the New Testament, about sheep and shepherds and, and so to the average kid who grows up, let's say, in the concrete jungle of the inner city, right, it may be that this kind of talking, this kind of discourse, has no persuasive power. And so there has to be some preacher at the local church who's going to then translate all of that stuff into terms that we can relate to, right? That's the job, that's good preaching, right? You're taking a book that's 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, or more, and you're translating it into contemporary terms and realities so that everyday people can understand what the essence of that teaching is, right? But then the implications here for Al-Farabi are that if indeed this is the nature of prophecy, the nature of religion vis-a-vis philosophy, he leaves open the possibility that such a being could have come in different places at different times, speaking different languages and using different symbols. And those symbols would have also included different practices, right? Different ways of fasting, different ways of praying, different ways of understanding the ultimate goal. And if that's the case, then it's quite possible that the world could be populated with equally true religions that conflict with one another in details of doctrine and practice. Because the problem with those of us who can't live in a world of religious pluralism, the problem is that our attachment is generally to these symbolic forms of discourse, including the language, a way of talking about God or reality or ultimate happiness or ultimate truth. And so what Al-Farabi is basically saying is that it's quite possible that different prophetic beings at different times would have medicinally laid out different techniques, different practices, and different articulations of the goal according to the realities of their own moment in their own time. Now, Al-Farabi will not go further than this, but it's interesting because the Andalusian, the medieval Muslim Spanish philosopher Ibn Tufayl does. He takes it another step further for us. And Ibn Tufayl tells us a story about a Robinson Crusoe kind of character, a guy who grows up on an island. There are two different theories about how he got there. One is that he spontaneously generated, another one is that he was shipwrecked. But in any case, this guy then is taken as a child of one of the deer, by a doe. He's suckled by the doe, so he drinks the doe's milk. He grows up, no language. He grows up, and as he grows up, and he initially tries to follow the ways of the animals, but he initially begins to observe his world around him, and he sees that there's a cause and effect relationship between things. Right? And he's beginning to observe, and he always thinks that if something happens, it has to have a cause. And so he's beginning to look at the stars, and beginning to think about life. So he's got this, no language, right? He's got this natural philosophical spirit, and then one day his mother, the doe, dies. And he senses that the dissipation of a spirit, of like a warm, moist energy escapes from her. And of course he's grief-stricken, but then he begins to think about things both physical and metaphysical. And he comes to this Aristotelian conclusion that an infinite recess of possibilities is impossible. So there must be some cause which itself is not caused. And then he spends his days meditating upon that uncaused cause. So here's this wild, natural philosopher on an island who has already come to realize God without any help from revelation or language or anything else. So, as it happens, this group of religious sailors are shipwrecked on his island, and one of them comes to finds this savage, right? And he says, well, I have to teach this savage, right? So he teaches him language and teaches him the ability to speak, and gradually, as the island philosopher begins to speak, the guy who taught him languages realizes that he's very profound, and he has understanding that even surpasses some of the religious scholars back home. And so what he does is he convinces the island philosopher, Hai, to go back to his society. We can just kind of presume that we're talking about a kind of Islamic society. But he brings him back to meet with the religious scholars of his own society. So they sail back to his society because he thinks that everyone needs to benefit from this incredible wisdom of this natural philosopher who has come to know God on his own, through his own contemplative practice. And so Hai, the natural philosopher, the island philosopher, begins to teach the religious scholars. But the religious scholars can't handle that pure discourse because they're down here. And their insistence is that, no, we can't have this conversation unless all these things are agreed upon. These are kind of non-negotiables. And the island philosopher looks at their religious system and sees that it works. He sees that it makes sense within their own cultural environment. And so he tells his friend, he says, no, it's really not good for me to be here. Because these people can't handle what I have to teach, and they're really okay with what they're doing, right? And so the two of them then sail back to the island and live the rest of their lives in contemplation of the one. And so what Ibn Tufayl does is he takes the Farabian foundation and he moves it through to its conclusion. And that is that we often mistake religion for truth. Whereas the Farabian point is that no. Religion already is in language. And the moment you put something in language, you place it in terms that are historically and culturally bound. Right? The moment you've taken an idea like God and you put it in language, that you then confuse the signifier for that which is signified. Right? You confuse the word for the reality outside of language, outside of time, outside of history, that word represents. And so what Al-Farabi is saying is that then, of course, it's possible that different religions and different societies at different periods of history could have and would have and did emerge that conflict with one another in points of doctrine, in language, and in practices, and yet are in total agreement about the ultimate goal or the ultimate direction in which they are trying to move humanity as a vehicle. And so what Al-Farabi then does is he, in the 9th century, in the dawn of the 10th century, the first half of the 10th century, he is addressing a problem that clearly was for him an existential problem. In the same way that his attention upon the philosophy of language was in a way a response to the humiliation of his beloved logic teacher at the hands of the quick-tongued and quick-witted Muslim grammarian, right? So too, as the Muslim student of Christian teachers, and he himself, his star student, ended up being a Christian. And so the leadership of the Alexandrian school in Baghdad went from Christians to this Turkish Muslim and back to a Jacobite Christian, Yahya bin Adi, in an unbroken chain. And so it's clear that Al-Farabi, this was a question that he himself was concerned about. And he addresses, albeit in a non-direct way, he addresses in his understanding of prophecy and religion, and what I call the relative truth of religious teaching. And when I say relative truth, it doesn't mean that you have your truth, I have my truth. It's relative in that way. It's relative to the cultural moment, and to the language, and to the conditions of the prophetic imagination when it was activated in this prophetic context at that moment. And as a result of its activation in that context at that moment, then we have the mobilization of humanity in a very dramatic and massive way. And so who would have thought, right, that Jesus of Nazareth, right, this kind of witty, counter-status quo, unschooled but brilliant rabbinical teacher in Palestine during the Roman period, who would have thought that such a historical wave would issue forth? Who would have thought that Muhammad, right, this technically illiterate Arab from a part of the world where nobody went and nobody wanted to go, part of the world where they didn't want anyone else to come in. And so there was no talk of tourism in Saudi Arabia back in, the 6th century. These were people who were quite okay living their own life. So what would have been considered a global backwater, right? Who would have thought that such a powerful historical wave would have issued forth from such a person? In a culture, from an illiterate person, a culture of writing and reading and knowledge and book learning. Who would have thought, right? Siddhartha Gautama, right? Or who would have thought Zarathustra, who had great difficulty getting followers in his own time. Zarathustra had a really difficult time, according to all accounts I've ever read, had a really difficult time finding a king who would endorse him or people who would embrace him. But what Al-Farabi is basically saying then is that the problem of religious diversity, the problem of religious pluralism, is simply the problem of linguistic diversity and cultural pluralism and historical change. And yet we, the clingers to the prophetic images, he says it may be necessary for someone to believe, as one of the religious teachers I study, Al-Ghazali, who also died a couple hundred years after Al-Farabi, but he says, sometimes it's important for someone to believe in these symbols in an absolute way so that their faith is absolutely unshakable, because that's the only way they're ever going to get to where they need to go. But Al-Farabi would say that while it's acceptable for you to cling to these symbols and this language in that kind of tenacious and uncompromising and exclusivistic way, that the foundations themselves would argue that, or the essence of prophecy itself would argue that the difference of religious language and symbol is as natural to us as anything else, is our biodiversity, or our linguistic diversity, or our ethnic diversity, or our gender diversity, or any other form of diversity that we encounter. So the reason why I want to focus on this is because very often in the study of philosophy, we study these figures because, oh, well, he influenced so-and-so, and we have this philosophical domino effect of, well, this person then influenced this person, and that's why they're important for us to know, or this person preserved this book of Aristotle, and so we have it in Arabic now as opposed to in Greek. You know, there are lots of ways in which we can strip the brilliance and profundity of these people away from them by just assigning them a place in the domino game of history. And one of the things that my teacher at the University of Toronto always taught us is that while the discussion of the history of philosophy is important, we should never, ever forget to take the ideas seriously. And whether it's like this, whether the psychological explanation of philosophy and prophecy is actually like this or not, is beside the point. One of the things that's remarkable about Al-Farabi is that here's a guy living within a Muslim society more than 1,000 years ago who was able to courageously develop and creatively develop a model that is truly elegant. It's a model that truly speaks with elegance and persuasive power about the relationship between religion and philosophy, the relationship even between religion and science today. So much so that this gentleman I referred to a moment ago, who lived a few hundred years after Al-Farabi, said, look, if you can demonstratively prove to me scientifically that something is not the way the Quran says it is, it doesn't mean that the Quran is wrong, and it doesn't mean that science is wrong. It just means that our scientific inquiry has revealed to us that we've been reading the Quran wrong. And so we have to change the way we read the sacred text. That in this passage, clearly it wasn't meant to be taken literally, or clearly it doesn't say what we have thought it says. But this idea of trying to reconcile science and religion, or prophecy and philosophy, is something that we have struggled with for, well, as long as we've had religion, let's say. And I'll end with a quotation from one of my favorite native North American teachers. And because I didn't begin with a recognition of the fact that the land in which we're having this conversation is indigenous land. And the land in which we're having this conversation has been the theater of their persecution and their usurpation and the denigration of these peoples who continue to stand so nobly and so instructively as the defenders of the creation and defenders of the dignity and sanctity of life. So I should end with a reference to the indigenous peoples. And here Black Elk tells the story in his own autobiography. It's his biography. He didn't write it, so it wasn't his autobiography. But his biography, Black Elk, is asked the question about the pipe. He's about to introduce the peace pipe and smoke it with his guest before they enter the story of his life. And he tells the story of the pipe, which is the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman, how the pipe came to his people. This woman, this beautiful woman, dressed all in white buckskin, appeared in two